The city park was quiet in the early evening, the sky beginning to take on shades of deep purple and navy blue as dusk settled, and the faint sound of children playing echoed from a nearby playground, and families enjoyed their evening walks under the glow of the street lamps. In the middle of this calm scene was Alice Dixon, a tall, athletic black woman in her early 40s with a warm but determined expression that reflected years of resilience. With her was her 10-year-old daughter, Sarah, a lively and curious girl who idolized her mother and hung on her every word. Tonight was a special evening for them both. It was one of those rare days when Alice could leave her worries behind and spend uninterrupted time with Sarah, showing her the basics of skateboarding, a new hobby that Sarah had recently become obsessed with. Alice, who had grown up skateboarding on rougher streets than this, was thrilled to share her skills with her daughter, eager to see her learn the same balance and confidence that had carried Alice through so many challenges in her own life. As Sarah placed her foot on the skateboard and wobbled, Alice laughed and held her arms out, ready to catch her if she fell. "Just keep your knees bent, baby," Alice said, her voice gentle but firm. "And remember, if you lose balance, don't be afraid. Just let yourself fall naturally. I'm here, and you'll be fine." Sarah looked up at her mother with wide, trusting eyes and gave a determined nod for her. This was more than just a lesson in skateboarding. It was a chance to be like her mom, brave, steady, and unafraid. While Alice focused on her daughter, she remained alert, her instincts honed from years of experience in dealing with difficult situations. Her life had not been easy. Raised in a rough neighborhood and having faced countless challenges, Alice had learned to defend herself both physically and emotionally. She was a fighter by nature, though she rarely showed this side of herself, especially in public. Her past had shaped her into a resilient woman who knew how to stay calm under pressure, a trait she now hoped to pass on to Sarah. But tonight was supposed to be about joy, not survival. She pushed those thoughts aside and focused on Sarah, watching her daughter beam with pride every time she managed to stay balanced on the skateboard a few seconds longer. To Alice, these small moments were precious. They were rare breaks in a life filled with hard work, responsibility. As a single mother, Alice worked tirelessly to provide for her family, and moments like these were her reward, a chance to be present and connect with her daughter in ways that went beyond words. In the distance, however, a figure appeared, moving purposefully toward them. It was Officer Mark Copeland, a middle-aged white police officer with a reputation that was well known around town, but not for reasons he'd want anyone to celebrate. He had served on the force for nearly 2 decades, but those years had left him bitter, hardened by a life he felt had cheated him out of the success he deserved. His frustration had long since twisted into resentment, and his prejudices, once subtle, had become more blatant over time. Mark Copeland had a particularly deep-seated bias against black residents in his jurisdiction. He viewed them with suspicion and disdain, often believing they didn't belong in certain parts of town. His biases had led him to harass numerous innocent people under the guise of protecting the neighborhood. And tonight, seeing Alice and Sarah in what he considered a clean park filled with mostly white families triggered his prejudice in his mind. Alice was just another black woman who needed to be reminded of her place. As he approached, Alice noticed him out of the corner of her eye. Her body instinctively tensed, but she maintained her outward calm. She didn't want to alarm Sarah, who was still wobbling on her skateboard. Oblivious to the officer's approach, Alice had encountered officers like Copeland before, men who saw her skin color as a threat, men who assumed she was troubled without ever knowing her story. She had long since learned to handle these encounters with restraint, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. But as the officer's heavy boots crunched closer on the gravel path, Alice's instincts told her that this time might be different. Copeland stopped a few feet away, his stance aggressive and his eyes cold. He looked at Alice and Sarah with a barely concealed snare, as if their mere presence in the park was an affront without any formalities. He barked, "You don't belong here." His voice was loud enough to catch Sarah's attention, and the little girl turned to look at him, confusion in her eyes. Alice took a deep breath, suppressing the surge of anger rising within her. She stepped forward, slightly shielding Sarah with her body. She had no intention of letting this man intimidate her or her daughter, especially on what was supposed to be their night of bonding. "We're just enjoying the park, officer," she said calmly, her voice steady. "It's public property, and we have every right to be." Here the officer's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, intruding into her personal space. "You think you can just do whatever you want, don't you?" he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "I've seen people like you before causing trouble thinking you own the place." He barely glanced at Sarah, who had instinctively moved closer to her mother, her small hand gripping Alice's shirt. Sarah was old enough to sense the tension, even if she didn't fully understand it. Alice clenched her jaw, her fists tightening at her sides, but she forced herself to stay calm for Sarah's sake. She looked the officer straight in the eye and said, "I don't know what you think we're doing here, but we're not causing any trouble. My daughter is just learning how to skateboard, that's all." Officer Copeland laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Oh, I bet teaching her how to break rules early. Starting them young, just like the rest of you." His words were sharp, each one a deliberate attempt to provoke. He was pushing, testing to see if he could break the calm exterior she wore so well. Alice felt her control slipping, her anger simmering beneath the surface, but she reminded herself that reacting would only make things worse. She knew men like him thrived on control, on forcing others to submit, but she was not going to let him intimidate her or make her daughter feel unsafe. However, as Alice stood her ground, something in her silence seemed to enrage Officer Copeland further. He wasn't used to people, especially black women, holding their own against him. He took another step forward, towering over her now, and sneered, "Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respect." And with that, he did the unthinkable. In a sudden, unprovoked move, he raised his hand and slapped Alice across the face. The force of the blow made her stumble back a step, and the sharp sting radiated across her cheek. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Sarah gasped, her small voice breaking the silence, and her eyes filled with fear as she looked at her mother, not fully understanding but terrified. Nonetheless, Alice straightened her hand, instinctively reaching up to touch her cheek. Her face burned with pain, but what hurt more was the humiliation, the blatant show of power and disregard for her humanity. She looked up at Copeland, and in that moment something shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Sarah, who was watching everything. It was about every time she'd been told to know her place, and now more than ever she felt the need to show her daughter that no one had the right to treat them this way. Alice took a deep breath, gathering herself. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She looked the officer dead in the eyes, a cold, unwavering resolve hard-hearting her gaze. She was done holding back. Alice's heart pounded as she felt the sting of the slap radiate through her cheek, but she didn't allow herself even a second to process the pain. Her daughter Sarah was staring up at her with wide, terrified eyes, clutching her skateboard like a lifeline. In that moment, Alice knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for her daughter, who was watching her every move, learning from her reaction. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, though her mind was racing. This wasn't the first time Alice had faced prejudice or even aggression, but it was the first time someone had dared to lay a hand on her so blatantly in public without a hint of remorse. She knew men like Officer Copeland and saw people like her as lesser, as if she didn't deserve the same respect as others, but to strike her in front of her daughter was a line she could not allow him to cross without consequence. Alice's instincts screamed at her to retaliate, but she was painfully aware of the power dynamic Copeland wore a badge, and as a single black mother, she understood the dangers that came with standing up to authority figures who had no hesitation in abusing their power. Yet something inside her shifted as she looked at Sarah. Her daughter was watching, and Alice could not afford to let fear dictate her response. Alice straightened up, fixing her gaze on Copeland with a fierce determination that caught even him. Offered, she saw a flicker of doubt cross his face, a hesitation as he realized she wasn't going to simply shrink away in submission. But before he could fully process it, Alice spoke, her voice steady and sharp, cutting through the tense silence between them. "You had no right to touch me," she said, her tone low but resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong." And you know it, whatever authority you think you have doesn't give you the right to assault people, not me and not anyone. Copeland's face twisted into a sneer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. He wasn't accustomed to defiance, especially not from someone he viewed as beneath him. He stepped closer, his presence looming, and his voice was laced with condescension and barely disguised contempt. Who do you think you are, talking to me like that? He spat, looking her up and down as if she was something he'd found under his boot. You should know your place. You think you can just waltz around here acting like you own the place? You people are all the same, thinking the rules don't reply to you. Alice clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to control her anger. She could feel Sarah's grip tightening on her arm, her daughter's silent plea for safety pulling her back from the edge. But she couldn't just let this go, not this time, not with Sarah watching. This was her moment to show her daughter that they didn't have to accept being treated as less than anyone else. She took her another step forward, closing the distance between her and Copeland. Her voice was calm, almost icy, and the unwavering confidence in her tone caught him off guard. I don't care what you think of me, she said, each word deliberate, but you will not touch me again. Not here, not anywhere, not in front of my daughter. Her words hung in the air, a bold challenge to the authority he so clearly believed he had over her. She could see the conflict flash across his face, the mix of anger and surprise as he processed her defiance. Copeland's grip on his own authority was slipping, and it was evident that he didn't know how to handle someone like her, someone who wasn't afraid to call them out. His face flushed with anger, and his voice dropped to a near growl. You think you're brave, don't you? You think I won't put you in your place? Let me remind you that I'm the one in control here. I could arrest you right now if I wanted to. Alice held her ground, her gaze steady and unyielding. You can try, she replied coolly, but you'll regret it. Copeland's hand twitched as if he were considering reaching for his handcuffs, but something about the way Alice stood, unwavering and unafraid, seemed to unnerve him. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. He glanced around, perhaps realizing that there were more people in the park now, that eyes were beginning to turn their way. He was no longer in control of the narrative, and the possibility of witnesses watching him lose control seemed to bring a hint of doubt into his otherwise arrogant demeanor. Alice sensed his hesitation, and it only strengthened her resolve. She took a small, controlled step, stepped back just enough to give herself a bit more distance, but her eyes never left his. Her voice softened, not out of fear, but as a deliberate choice to show him that she was not afraid. You can intimidate people all you want, Officer Copeland, but it won't work on me. I know my rights, and I know yours. What you did was assault, and there are consequences for that. Copeland's face darkened. He took a step forward, his jaw clenched, clearly not willing to let her have the last word. Consequences? He laughed, though the sound was hollow. For you, maybe, but don't think for a second that anyone's going to take your side over mine. Alice felt the familiar sting of those words, a reminder of the inequality that permeated her life and the lives of so many others, but instead of letting it dishearten her, it only fueled her determination. She was done allowing people like Copeland to dictate her life, to make her feel small, to teach her daughter that this was normal, that this was something they had to accept. Just then a passerby, an older man with a grizzled beard and a weathered face, stopped nearby, watching the interaction with a look of concern. Alice saw him out of the corner of her eye, and a glimmer of hope flickered within her. She wasn't alone. She didn't need an army. She just needed one person, one witness who could see the truth of what was happening. Sensing his growing loss of control, Copeland's face twisted further. In anger, he could feel his grip on the situation slipping, and it infuriated him. Without warning, he reached out, grabbing Alice's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. The suddenness of the motion startled her, and for a split second her resolve wavered, but then instinct took over. In a swift motion, Alice twisted her arm, breaking free from his grip. With a move she hadn't practiced in years, but remembered well, she took a step back, positioning herself between Copeland and Sarah, her stance steady, and prepared. Her years of training in self-defense flooded back. Every lesson she'd learned about protecting herself and those she loved. She had tried to keep things calm to avoid escalation, But Copeland had forced her hand. He had crossed a line that she could no longer ignore. Copeland's face turned from arrogance to shock as he stumbled back, momentarily thrown off balance by her unexpected resistance. The passerby stepped closer, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening, and a few other people nearby started to watch more closely, their murmurs growing louder. "Let go of my mother." Sarah's voice cut through the tension, clear and strong. Despite the fear in her eyes, she took a brave step forward, standing beside Alice, her small frame brimming with determination. Alice placed a protective arm around Sarah's shoulders, her gaze still locked on Copeland. Her voice was calm, but the underlying strength was unmistakable. "You have no right to touch us. If you so much as think about laying another hand on me or my daughter, I promise you this will not end well for you." For a moment, Copeland's bravado faltered. He was used to people backing down to them, cowering in fear, especially when he resorted to force. But Alice was different. She didn't just stand her ground, she was ready to defend herself if necessary, and he could see that in her eyes. She was no ordinary woman. She was a mother, a protector, someone who had nothing to lose when it came to defending her family. The crowd around them continued to grow, and Copeland finally seemed to grasp that he was outmatched, not in strength, but in support. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides, but he could see that the situation was no longer in his favor. He took a step back, the anger still burning in his eyes, but there was a hint of something else now, hesitation, maybe even fear. Alice watched him, refusing to break eye contact. She had stood her ground, protected her daughter, and shown Copeland that he could not bully her into submission. She didn't need to raise her voice or fight back with aggression. Her strength came from her resolve, from her unshakable commitment to her daughter, and from her refusal to be intimidated. As Copeland turned and walked away, muttering under his breath, Alice finally allowed herself to breathe. Pulling Sarah into a tight embrace, she whispered softly, "It's okay, baby, we're okay." But inside she knew this was only the beginning. She had stood her ground today, but she also understood that standing up to someone like Copeland consequences. Once she was now prepared to face, the tension lingered in the air, like a storm that hadn't fully passed. The echoes of Officer Copeland's retreating footsteps still faintly audible in the distance. Alice held Sarah close, feeling her daughter's small heart pounding through her jacket. She didn't loosen her protective grip until she was certain Copeland was gone. Finally, she let out a deep breath, looking down at Sarah, whose wide eyes reflected a mix of fear and awe. "Mom," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, but filled with admiration. "You weren't scared of him. You didn't let him push us around." Alice gave her daughter a reassuring smile, though the adrenaline still coursed through her own veins. She brushed a lock of Sarah's hair away from her face. "Baby, sometimes you have to stand up no matter how scared you are. Inside, nobody has the right to treat us like we're less than anyone else." Just as they began to turn away, intending to leave the park and put as much distance between themselves and the memory of Copeland as possible, a harsh voice shattered the brief moment of peace. "Well, look who thinks she's a hero." Alice's entire body went rigid, the blood draining from her face. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach as she saw Copeland standing a few yards away, his hands clenched into fists. This time, he wasn't alone. He had brought two other officers with him, both of them white men who wore the same smug, unyielding expressions that Copeland did. Reinforcements. Her mind spun, and she instinctively pulled Sarah closer, her fingers tightening around her daughter's hand. "What do you want?" Alice's voice was calm, but inside her thoughts raced, evaluating every possible scenario. She knew what this was. Copeland wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed after the embarrassment she had caused him. He was back for retribution, his bruised ego demanding to be restored, and now he had back up. One of the new officers, a younger man with close-cropped blonde hair, stepped forward. His eyes flicked over Alice and Sarah, his expression cold and calculating. "We got a report about a disturbance here," he said, his tone laced with accusation. "Apparently you assaulted an officer." Mama Alice's mind reeled. Assaulted? He was twisting the truth, manipulating the situation to make her look like the aggressor. She had merely defended herself, yet she knew that her words alone wouldn't batter in the face of their united front. She could feel the weight of their combined authority pressing down on her, an oppressive force designed to make her question herself, to make her feel powerless. "I didn't assault anyone, Alice.